We're gonna go live, by the way.
Yep.
Assalamu alaikum. How's it going, Dr. Bedr?
Good. It's fine. How is it going your end?
Alhamdulillah. I'm in a lot of blessing.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Um, how's your week been?
It's been good. It's been quite good. Alhamdulillah.
Let's get right into the topics, and enough with that small talk.
But don't forget the disclaimer.
Yeah. The disclaimer is that anything you hear in this podcast is not investment advice. It's not to be understood as, personalized advice to buy or sell any securities. It is simply the opinions of myself and Bedr. In fact, my opinion is not necessarily the opinion of Bedr. We have different views on many things. So understand that we are speaking just from our personal perspectives, and you should do your own due diligence before you make any investment decisions. This podcast is for informational purposes only. With that out of the way, let's talk about China, and let's talk about their plans. There's been some chatter in the last week that China plans to prevent Chinese companies from listing in foreign markets, primarily the US, in foreign markets for the purposes of raising money. That is, Chinese companies that are data heavy, that hold a lot of sensitive consumer data, will be prevented from listing on something like the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. Better if you could give us your take on this, and then I'll follow with my 2 cents.
Yeah. So I think it's important to say, well, they're not. I don't think they're preventing in that sense, but I think the political word is like limiting or putting a bit more regulations on that, which companies can do that. And I assume the problem is simply a matter of reporting. They worry that if these companies are allowed to be listed on the U.S. stock exchanges, that means that they're open to being investigated by the SEC, or they must. I don't know, if someone sues them, then they're able to access some of their records in court. And obviously, the Chinese don't want something like that. That is probably the reason behind it. And what does that mean? What will that mean? Well, for the companies, of course, that means they're limited in terms of how much financing they can collect. They won't be able to access a large chunk of the market. But then again, and that's the tricky part that I don't know, are the Chinese planning to do that globally, in the sense that, okay, they're not even allowed to list on the London stock exchanges or the European stock exchanges? How much of the limitation are they planning on? Is it just that they're worried about the SEC, or are they worried generally? Because remember, US investors can access companies, even Chinese companies, through the European markets, for example. So I'm not sure how strict this is going to be implemented.
Right. I'll tell you my 2 cents. And my 2 cents is that I've mentioned this on this YouTube channel many times, is that the Chinese Communist government is not just a normal government, right? They seek control, and things that are not controlled by them are typically banned eventually. And we saw that with cryptocurrencies. They couldn't control it, so it ended up getting banned. And I think it's the same with these Chinese companies. And now they're saying that, okay, this is going to be limited to companies that have sensitive data information. One of the companies that was mentioned is a company that does ride sharing in China. And my question is, well, what company these days doesn't hold sensitive customer information, especially if it's a company of the size that it's going to be listed on a public exchange? So this is going to be a wide affecting new regulation that is going to affect, I think, most Chinese companies that people even care to invest in. And accordingly, I think it is now from an ethical perspective, if you just look at, the way that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist government treats Uyghur Muslims, we all know about their plight, and the repugnant things that are being done against them. If we look at some of the other human rights abuses that happen in China, and I'm not saying that other places in the world are perfect, but it seems to me clear that China is worse off than most of the rest of the world in terms of the way it treats its citizenry. And from that ethical perspective, haven't invested in any Chinese companies, whether it's Neo, Xpeng, Baba, any of these well-known Chinese companies. I've avoided investing in for this ethical consideration. But if you're not prevented from the ethical consideration, I'd say that you're really rolling the dice owning these Chinese companies. I don't know if they end up getting delisted from American exchanges or not, but I think it's certainly possible, and if not probable. And investors need to be aware of this real risk. They say that there's a saying that says power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And with time, I think that the power that the Chinese Communist government has been able to consolidate in itself is going to cause it to make a lot of decisions that are not necessarily in the company's best interest, the Chinese company's best interest, and certainly not in the best interest of foreign investors. So proceed with caution when it comes to owning Chinese companies, is what I say.
But I have to say, so I'm not sure if you already know that the Chinese already have they have an A and B listing inside China. So a lot of shares, you have A shares and B shares of Chinese companies. And the difference, if I remember correctly, the A shares are only for Chinese citizens, nationals. So you can't even buy them as a foreign investor, and you can only buy into B shares. So they already have some limitations on foreign ownership of their companies, which basically means it will never happen that you as a foreigner can overtake one of their companies by buying 100% of the stock, because at maximum you will buy all the B shares, which are maybe, I don't know, 30% of the stock, but there's still 70% out there. But the point I want to mention here is that I believe most people buy into them as sort of a diversification strategy. You don't want to have all your shares in Western companies or in US companies, but you want to basically diversify. And that's basically the argument for buying Japanese companies, for example. Sure. But then comes the point you mentioned, which is the legal predictability. You don't know what kind of regulations are going to pop up. You don't know how things will change. You can rationally guess that, well, the Chinese won't want to do anything that will lead all the foreign investors to run away with their money and leave. So that should be a bit making you okay, not too worried, but you don't know where the limits are. So as you mentioned very nicely with cryptocurrencies, that was a very hard limit that they put very suddenly. And if you had something out there, then you might have lost it very, very quickly. You wouldn't have had a chance to pull out. But I do have to mention that I have some sympathy to this very strict control when it comes to something like climate change, because they're able to regulate these things much quicker than what a normal capitalist free market would do. Here you would still have to go through, well, let's tax carbon and let's hope that people react quick enough. And maybe the Chinese can do it a bit faster, a bit better, but every system has its pros and cons. And for foreign investor in stocks, well, I can see a lot of cons in that sense.
Yeah, well, this brings up a bigger point, and I think perhaps goes more to the heart of what I see as perhaps the biggest threat to humanity at this point, is that people are looking at the Chinese model and they're saying, oh, well, maybe it is more efficient if, this authoritarian way of doing things, maybe it is more efficient. Maybe this democracy and back and forth and having to get consensus, it's really slow, it's inefficient, it doesn't really work as well as something like the Chinese model. And I think that previously this question was answered with the failure of the Soviet Union, and people were like, oh, now we know that the system, the superior system is the system where you have back and forth, you have feedback loops, you have accountability. But now I think the question is posing itself again. And I think that a lot of people are starting to be swayed towards this Chinese model, wherein you're saying, it might be more efficient if we just sort of dictated top down, didn't have to deal with all this, all these considerations that an accountable government has to deal with. But I think ultimately, if we look at Islam and we look at what Islam, the boundaries that Islam puts for us, and we work within those boundaries, I think that's the most efficient system. And so a system wherein people, have the right to speak up, have the right to hold government officials accountable. If the system is not efficient, it should be improved in terms of its efficiency, but in a way that still respects these rights that people have. And I think the biggest challenge to humanity right now is the Chinese model and the efficiencies that it's showing other countries, and competing with that model with an alternative model that is more efficient, but that respects the rights of the citizenry within that model and provides a good life for them. I think that's really the challenge for humanity.
But I think that I think we already have the framework. So even if you look at if you're talking about, the giving and taking in a normal democracy is a bit too long or inefficient, that's not completely true. When you look at the details, we know that we have things like emergency laws that kick in. If you consider, climate change is a big problem, it's a life-threatening situation. Well, in theory, you can say, the parliament can very quickly give emergency powers to the president in the US, and he can then act almost with an authoritarian measure, but he will be held accountable eventually. And in that sense, you do have all the efficiencies that you want from the Chinese model. So that would usually be my idea, that you already have the right system. It's already in place. The only problem that people are a bit disillusioned because of the political stalemates that we're seeing, for example, in the US over the last, maybe decade or something. So I wouldn't blame them for a decade of stalemate, but I still see that the democratic system with an accountable government, with the ability to go into emergency powers in case of a war, or so I was reading about the hurricane that's coming to the southern states in the US, and we hope that things go well there, that it doesn't become a problem. But we already know that there are emergency powers. We do have these efficiencies. We don't need to move to a complete authoritarian model to get that kind of efficiency in reacting quickly to a crisis.
Well, then I mean, basically what you're saying is that the model is efficient when we follow the rules of, this other model that we're competing with. But let me say, I'll say this as it relates to, democratic systems and their efficiency. And it might be a crazy thought, but I think that this is something that we should probably try. And that is, what the inefficiencies that have come up with, like the democratic system, I think, from my perspective, are coming from the fact that, you have this old system wherein people would elect representatives, and these representatives would go to, the capital, and they would be basically or a representative of the will of their constituents. So they're never a perfect representative of the will of their constituents. They're an imperfect representative of the will of their constituents. because oftentimes they get pressure from different lobbying groups. They get, they have other interests other than just purely representing their constituents. Now, the thought that I have is that, with this blockchain technology and the advances that that's seeing, we don't really need, moving forward, representatives for people to represent their will. We could just have people directly voting on the issues that are at hand. And I think that would solve a really big problem in terms of efficiencies of the system. Now, obviously, there's a lot of details that need to be worked out there.
So,
I get that.
No, but I mean,
just moving from this representative government to just a direct democracy where people are voting on the matters that affect them, I think would increase the efficiency of the system.
Yeah, without going into a big debate about that, so I've had a lot of talks with people from the political sciences, and the only problem that I always saw in that is, do we have enough time not to vote, but to learn about what we're voting on? So the idea is that the representative is a full-time job, or he has the time to read all the details before voting on something that you might not read entirely about or be completely familiar with. But what I do know, I think Switzerland, for example, does that when it's a very simple question. They do pose a complete direct democracy. Everyone has to vote on it. When it's something that is very clear to everyone, that doesn't need too much thinking about, that is not so detailed, then they would allow it. So you can Google stuff like that. When do they allow a direct democracy in that sense?
Sure.
But so I do agree that this idea is correct, but maybe not in every single position.
Sure.
Let's leave that for the political people and jump into our next point.
I have to remind myself that this is practical Islamic finance.
But I think this is still part, because remember, Islamic finance exists in economies that are affected by politics. So we do have to be a bit more aware and not just look at the stock market, for example. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Speaking of the stock market, this gives me a chance to transition to the next topic. Let's talk about Peloton Stock. Peloton is a company, for those who are unfamiliar, is a company that makes home-based workout equipment. And I guess what's unique, but no longer that unique about this equipment, is that it's connected to other devices. And you can do like live workouts. You can connect with friends when you're working out, push each other. That's really the idea behind it. I never saw, honestly, any justification. I could never justify the valuation that it was trading for. I mean, you're talking about a company that makes, stationary bikes. That's their flagship product. Stationary bikes with essentially an iPad strapped to the front that can connect with other iPads, and it's trading even after. So it lost year to date. It's lost 30% of its value. Last year, because of the quarantine, everyone was stuck at home. It did very well. It was up close to 400%, I think. But this year it's down year to date around 30%. The recent quarterly report was kind of disappointing. They announced that they were going to slash the price of their bikes by $400, which, I mean, even after the slash, it's a $1,500 stationary bike with an iPad strapped to it. So, I mean, it's not necessarily a steal. You can always consider going out and getting some fresh air every now and then, but also what's clear is that they're having to spend a lot more money on marketing. And this to me is when I say this is one of the biggest red flags for me, is when a company is having to spend so much money on marketing and continuously increase the money that it's spending on marketing, because it tells me that the customers are no longer as motivated as they may have been previously to promote the product organically. Something I love about Tesla is that you never see a Tesla ad because they don't need it.
Yeah.
Because people who own Teslas can't stop talking about them.
It's like word of mouth marketing.
Exactly. That's the most effective way to promote a product is and the most influential way for me to try a product is if I hear it from a friend, from someone who I trust, someone who has experience with it. Word of mouth is really unbeatable when it comes to marketing. And you would think with a product like Peloton, wherein you're connecting with other people who are working out, that word of mouth would be enough. But apparently, it's far from it, as evidenced by the marketing spend that they have to do. And I'll leave with this idea, and then let you comment better, which is that I prioritize like personal experience with a product whenever I buy a company. And I remember earlier this summer, I was at a hotel and I used Peloton, and my wife used Peloton because they had Peloton bikes in their workout workout facility. And we both walked away from that thinking that was not that unique of an experience at all. And so after that, I was like, so I thought that Peloton may be overvalued before I used the product, but after using the product, I was sure of it. I was certain. I was like, I don't want to be part, because I kept seeing, headlines with Peloton stock. So yeah, that's my take on the stock. What say you, Dr. Bedr?
Well, so I would say, of course, you have to always take care that people don't buy everything based on the practical value or direct value. There is, of course, some of the qualitative or intangibles. So if I tell you I was riding my bike at home, it's completely different, or I get a completely different value than when I brag about riding my Peloton at home. And some people are ready to pay a premium for that ability to say that. So there is some value to that people do pay for, and we have to agree on that. But I do agree that if your word of mouth marketing is not enough anymore, this seems to always be a red flag to some extent. I also heard that they had some legal problems because of some injuries that were happening. So I'm sure that's also affecting the price of the stock. And of course, the recent quarterly report wasn't that good, but some people explained it, well, it's because of the people are going out again, people are not locked inside again, so that will definitely affect it. So it was a bit convenient for them, the lockdowns, and now they're reverting back to where they should have been or would have been in a normal case. Whether it's completely, so I don't think it's completely bad investment. They are producing something, and it does have a good name. So if we come up with our iPad strapped to a bike, we won't be as successful. So I can't claim that. But so I don't, what I'm worried about is their growth potential. Let me put it that way. So maybe they will still sell some bikes, and maybe it still does have a name, and that name has some value to some people. But is it a good investment to go into that? Well, if you're expecting another lockdown, then maybe it is not a bad idea. But if not, then, and hopefully we're not expecting one. And of course, let's wait a bit for the legal problems that they have. That's also never a good sign.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll say we have Peloton stock on Practical Islamic Finance listed as comfortable to invest in. Myself and Taysir, who was reviewing Peloton with me when we published it, we looked at because they have previous incidents where they had safety issues with their workout equipment, and the allegation against them was that the disclaimers weren't sufficient. They didn't act fast enough to remedy the problems that were reported to them, and now it's coming up again. So I think we're going to need to relook at this stock and see, is there a systemic reason for this? and reevaluate how comfortable we are investing in this company, just from an ethical perspective.
But maybe just a
up until
small
now, I
point.
mean, they've been allegations. They haven't been. There's no conclusion yet. So I think a prudent way to approach this, and this is how we approach in practical Islamic finance, is that companies, people are innocent until proven guilty. I think we
Sure.
can afford them that. Go ahead, Dr.
Yeah.
Bennett.
So I want to say that we also have to be a bit fair. So I don't know, even if they do have some injuries, are they statistically different than other ones? So I'm sure that other bikes have injuries, and maybe the problem here is that you have way too much focus on them because they suddenly have a very big customer base. And sure, if you now hear that now they have, I don't know, 50 injuries, how much is that as a percent? Is it really much more than other bikes or not? So is this a dangerous product, or is that completely normal, but it's just a very popular bike? But what I do have to compliment you on is that, yeah, you should always be comfortable with revising your recommendations about the Sharia compliance or the ethical aspects of a stock. Things change, they act differently, their finances differ, their decisions differ, and you have to react based on that. So no one should come and say, well, wait a second, now you changed, now you have Peloton is uncomfortable. Why did you do that? Yeah, because things have changed, things are dynamic. And I find it very good that you and Taysir give the time to revise something and not simply say, well, we already published that, we're not going to look at it again. That is an important aspect.
Of course, I appreciate that. And sometimes we reach out to Dr. Bedder for the viewers for his opinion on certain stocks. So we have slated to talk about space and space stocks and investing in space stocks. So I guess we can address that really quickly. And then I'd like to get to the question of, because I posed to the Practical Islamic Finance community on our community tab questions that they'd like to ask us during this podcast. And one of the questions I thought was a good one, and it came from, I think it's Fadl. Fadl, his last name starts with a J. And we're gonna try and address that question. So quickly about space stocks, we have Rocket Labs recently basically became publicly accessible. This is a company that has actually done launches of satellites into space, and we're seeing a slew of other companies come into public trading that are in the space industry, basically. My comment on this is very succinct, and it's probably very predictable as well, is that don't invest in something that you don't understand. If you understand what the company is doing, you have some sort of insight into where you think the business that it's in is going to be, then I think it makes sense to dabble a bit. However, if you have no idea what you're doing, you have no idea what the products of these companies are, you haven't seen any products, you haven't the company hasn't produced anything yet, just understand the risks. And I'll refer you to the example of Nikola. So there was a lot of hype up around the EV market because of Tesla. Last year, Tesla basically did a tenfold in its price. So a lot of investors, FOMO'd their way into Nikola stock. And the company never produced anything. They produced drawings, they produced a truck that apparently was just rolling down a hill, but they didn't produce anything, and a lot of investors got burned by that. So be cautious when you're investing in these up and coming space companies. Now, I think Rocket Labs is probably more legit than the average space companies because they've actually done launches, but just proceed with caution, as we always say. Dr. Bedder?
Yeah, so I just answer a very common question that I get about investing in space. People always tell me, well, is it Sharia compliant to generally, not about a certain stock, but just the idea as an industry? And I tell them, well, I see nothing against it. So even from a Sharia perspective, the law always with Sharia, with muamalat, is that everything is permissible unless we have an explicit prohibition. from a text, from the Quran, from a hadith, and investing in space. Sure, that maybe wasn't something that was at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, but that doesn't make it non-Sharia compliant. As an industry, there is nothing wrong with it per se. When we come to more specifics, I would say, well, when we're looking at Sharia compliance, these are a bit more tricky, and they have a bit of similarity with something like nuclear power in the sense that, well, they produce a very, very specific type of waste in space and space trash. And how do they deal with that? What is their policy on that? There are some ethical considerations that are very similar, as I mentioned, when we talk about investing in a power company that has nuclear power. What do they do with their nuclear waste? That is something that is ethically important and has to be looked at. It's not the normal Sharia screening that we usually would do for a company that produces cars. It is a bit more complicated. So I'm just talking a bit more broadly so people would have that perspective as well.
Got it. Thank you. And thank you for this really nice segue into the next topic, which is the question that Fadl J was asking. Fadl asked the following. I think it's Fadl, it's either Fadl or Fadl, one of the two. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. So he says, you mentioned that Dr. Ahmed is a certified IOFI advisor. Can you please ask Dr. Ahmed, if we apply the IOFI stock screening criteria, we find that Apple and other companies that behave unethically are halal to invest in. Why does IOFI not take this into consideration? And then the second part of his question is, all major halal ETFs have Apple in their top holdings. Why is it that all major halal ETFs have Apple as part of their top holdings, despite the fact that we have clear evidence that Apple suppliers are using slave labor? What's your 2 cents on that?
Yeah, so I think the general answer is very, very simple. The IOFI standards are, if you read the standards themselves online, they're available. They are very, very purely financial. They are checking the financial screening. They don't claim to be ESG, so environment, social governance. They're not looking at that. They're not explicitly answering that question. That means you can find a company that is, I don't know, cutting down the Amazon forest and consider it halal. Maybe you and I would consider it uncomfortable or bad or completely haram, but the IOFI are not claiming that they're looking at a maqasid al-sharia, so a more general perspective. They're not looking at ethics. They are looking at pure, do they meet the percentages, the debt ratio percentages, are they producing alcohol, etc. But they're not looking at a more broad perspective. Maybe with time, that dynamic will change, that they will become a bit more broad. But at the moment, this is the reason why you have companies that are possibly unethical being listed as Sharia compliant. Why are they having such a high portion in the ETF business? Well, I believe mainly it's because of the dividends. So they pay quarterly dividends, and that is something that is quite interesting for the returns of an ETF. Remember that ETFs like to reinvest some of the money that comes out, and that is usually something that they like. They pay out dividends as well, and they need the cash to come from somewhere. So that might be one reason that they have it.
And I would add to that, that if you are a halal ETF or a halal fund, you're using that word, then I think it makes some sense for you to not just be concerned about returns, or else why are you calling yourself a halal ETF? What makes you unique? These ethical considerations are part of what makes something halal, and you need to do a better job at screening stocks. This is what I'm saying. But I mean, if you've taken that into consideration and your cost benefit analysis is different than mine, then okay, I understand that. Maybe, that there is, you have a different justification for it. I don't, claim to have, any sort of like moral insight that is necessarily unique from anyone else. But I think what these funds need to do a better job of communicating is what their cost benefit analysis was. Like, why do you think that this is actually, a moral investment to make? And that's something I'm having trouble finding when I'm studying these funds. So very, very quickly, I'm going to go through the comments that we have in the chat. So Sadiq said, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Is it halal to invest in Baidu? Baidu is a Chinese company. I've made it very clear what my stance on investing in Chinese companies is. I don't think it's true that, you can have a major Chinese company that is completely separate from the Chinese communist government. I don't think that's really practical. If you see things in a different way, then that's your decision. Kazmataz says, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Fadl, keep up the good work. Thank you for your comment. Important to have a space like this to discuss important topics. Thank you, sir. Assalamu alaikum, brothers. I have a question. I work for the US federal government, and the government 401k. 401k is basically a retirement plan, better. Yep. Is called the Thrift Saving Plan, TSP. We also receive a 5% match if we contribute at least 5% of our income. The problem is there are limited investment options with the TSP. And this is a very commonly asked question. I'm sure you get it a lot. There is an S&P 500 fund, small cap fund. These funds include companies both halal and haram. In this case, how would one go about taking advantage of the TSP in a halal way? Do you want to comment on this, or would you rather keep it for another podcast episode? Because I think it's probably
so maybe I can say
it might not be a short answer.
Yeah, just very short answer. Yeah, I mean, matching would be a good thing. That's a smart investment idea to follow it. How would you go about this when they're mixed? If you can find out how many companies are halal, how many are haram, and try to purify, that would be the official IOFI answer. Purify the parts that are haram. That means you donate them out to something that you don't get any benefit from. So that means you donate it without even getting a tax deduction or something from it, that you don't get a benefit from the haram money. And that way you get, that would be the best way to go about it.
I agree with that. Final question, which cryptos are halal, and what about Trust Wallet pancake staking? We can, now I've done a video about staking cryptos. Look that up on Practical Islamic Finance if you're interested. Which cryptos are halal? That's a very big question, and perhaps we will address it in future episodes, inshallah. We want to try to limit the episode to 30 minutes, so I'm going to end it here. Thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate your tuning in and your interaction. And thank you, Dr. Bedr, as always, for your valuable insights. Until next time, take care of yourself. Assalamu alaikum, and peace be upon you all.